Hello, and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel to the Caribbean, to a world of warm, dark water and green islands, and the particular smell of salt and heat that the tropics produce, a smell that is unlike anything in the cooler parts of the world, heavy and alive and full of the promise of something that might be danger or might be paradise, depending entirely on who you were and what you were carrying, and whether the ship coming over the horizon was flying a flag you recognized. We are going to the Caribbean in the 17th and early 18th centuries, to the age of pirates and buccaneers, and the wild, improbable world that grew up on the margins of the great colonial empires, in the spaces between the laws and the fleets, and the governors and the counting houses of powers that were too large to govern everything they claimed. This is the story of Tortuga and the pirates of the Caribbean, and it is one of the most remarkable stories in the whole history of the Atlantic world, because it is a story about what happens at the edge of empire, in the places where the rules do not quite reach, and where people who have nothing to lose discover, sometimes to their own surprise, that the absence of rules can be a kind of freedom. The pirates of the Caribbean were not heroes, at least not in any simple sense. They were violent and dangerous and often brutal, and the suffering they caused was real, but they were also, in ways that their contemporaries partly recognized and that later generations have found endlessly fascinating, something more complicated than simple criminals. They were people who had fallen out of the ordinary world and built something new in the space that the falling created, a world with its own rules and its own hierarchy and its own strange democracy, a world that lasted only a few decades before the forces of order caught up with it, but that left a mark on the imagination of the Western world that has never entirely faded. It is a story for the night. The Caribbean at night, when the heat of the day has softened and the dark water moves under a sky full of stars that you can see more clearly than anywhere in the north, because the air is cleaner and the nights are darker, and you are far from any city. The sound of the sea on a tropical shore is different from the sound of the sea in the north, warmer and slower, as if the water itself is more at ease. Let it come to you now, that sound, across the distance of 3 centuries and several thousand miles. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the warm Caribbean night come to you, and let the stories of the people who lived in it come with it. Let us begin. The Caribbean Sea is one of the most beautiful bodies of water on the planet, a semi-enclosed basin of warm blue water bounded by the islands of the Greater and Lesser Antilles, to the north and east, by the coasts of Central and South America, to the south and west, and opening to the Gulf of Mexico in the northwest. The islands that scatter across it range from the large and mountainous Hispaniola and Cuba and Jamaica and Puerto Rico, to the small and flat, the low coral islands and sandbars and cays that appear and disappear with the movement of sea and storm. The water is warm throughout the year, warmed by the tropical sun and by the currents that flow through the basin from the Atlantic, and it is clear in the shallows, over the coral reefs, in a way that allows you to see the bottom from a surprising depth, the fish and the coral and the white sand visible below in colors that seem almost impossibly vivid. The climate of the Caribbean is shaped by the trade winds, those reliable easterly winds that blow across the Atlantic from Africa, and that made the Caribbean one of the most navigable seas in the pre-mechanized world. The trade winds blow steadily from the northeast in the winter and from the east in the summer, and they allowed ships to move across the basin with a predictability that the more capricious winds of northern waters did not offer. The hurricane season, running roughly from June to November, was the great interruption to this pattern, when storms of terrifying power formed in the Atlantic and moved westward into the Caribbean, capable of destroying fleets and cities and everything else that stood in their path. The hurricanes were one of the constant dangers of Caribbean life, unpredictable in their individual tracks, but reliable in their seasonal timing, a natural violence that made the human violence of the pirate age seem almost modest by comparison. Before the Europeans arrived in force in the late 15th century, the Caribbean islands were home to several indigenous peoples, the most significant of whom were the Taino, the Arawak-speaking people who inhabited the larger islands and who were the people Christopher Columbus encountered when he arrived in 1492. The Taino had lived in the Caribbean for centuries before the Europeans came, and they had developed complex societies with their own agriculture and their own religion and their own social structures. Within a few decades of European contact, most of them were dead, killed by the diseases that the Europeans brought with them, by the violence of conquest, and by the conditions of forced labor that the Spanish colonial system imposed on the survivors. The elimination of the indigenous population was one of the defining catastrophes of the early colonial period in the Americas, and it cleared the way for the agricultural system that would transform the Caribbean over the following centuries, a system based on enslaved African labor and the production of sugar, tobacco, and other commodities for the markets of Europe. The Spanish were the first European power to establish a significant presence in the Caribbean, and for most of the 16th century, they treated the region as their own private domain, their exclusive right having been established by the papal division of the non-European world between Spain and Portugal in 1494. The Spanish colonial system was based on the extraction of silver and gold from the mainland colonies of Mexico and Peru, and the Caribbean islands were primarily way stations in this extraction, places where the treasure fleets stopped to take on supplies before making the long ocean crossing back to Spain. The ports of Havana in Cuba and Cartagena in what is now Colombia were the most important of these way stations, and the treasure that moved through them attracted the attention of every other European power that was watching the enormous wealth of the Americas with a combination of admiration and resentment. The French and the English, and later, the Dutch, were not willing to accept Spanish dominion over the entire Caribbean, and from the mid-16th century onward, they began probing the edges of the Spanish Empire, sending privateers who were essentially licensed pirates, sailors with letters of marque from their governments, authorizing them to attack Spanish shipping and Spanish ports, to harass the Spanish colonial system, and to take as much of its wealth as they could carry back. The line between privateer and pirate was always thin and often crossed because the licenses that authorized attacking Spanish ships did not always specify exactly which ships in which circumstances, and the distinction that mattered to the lawyers in London or Paris or Amsterdam was often invisible to the men on the ships themselves. The other great feature of the Caribbean world that shaped the pirate age was the plantation system that was developing rapidly in the 17th century as the European powers established their own colonies on the islands that Spain had not yet fully settled. The sugar plantations that the English established in Barbados and Jamaica and the French in the western part of Hispaniola were labor-intensive operations that required enormous numbers of workers, and since the indigenous population had been largely destroyed and European laborers were not available in sufficient numbers or at affordable prices, the plantation system became dependent on the transatlantic slave trade, the forced transportation of people from West Africa who were bought and sold and worked to death in the fields of the Caribbean. The slave trade and the plantation system were the dark heart of the Caribbean economy throughout the period of the Pirate Age, and they provide the essential context for understanding why the Caribbean was the kind of place it was, a place of enormous wealth and enormous violence, where the rules that governed ordinary life in Europe did not apply, and where people who had lost everything had nothing further to lose. The word buccaneer comes from the French word boucan, which referred to a wooden frame used for smoking meat, and the boucaniers were originally the people who used those frames. The hunters who lived on the western and northern coasts of Hispaniola in the early 17th century, surviving by hunting the wild cattle and pigs that had descended from animals brought by the Spanish, and that had multiplied prodigiously in the absence of serious predators. These hunters were an extraordinarily diverse group: runaway indentured servants and escaped slaves, and shipwrecked sailors and deserters from various European navies and armies, men who had fallen out of the ordinary social world for one reason or another, and who had ended up in one of the few places in the Caribbean where they could survive without being part of any formal colonial structure. The Spanish, who claimed Hispaniola as their territory, even though they had largely abandoned its western reaches, periodically sent expeditions to clear the bucaniers off the island, killing their cattle and driving them away from the places they had settled. These expeditions drove the hunters toward the sea and toward the small island of Tortuga, a rocky wooded island off the northwest coast of Hispaniola that was easy to defend and impossible to easily dislodge people from if they were willing to fight. The buccaneers brought with them to Tortuga their skills with the heavy muskets they used for hunting, which made them formidable skirmishers, and their experience of surviving in hostile environments with minimal resources, which made them adaptable. They also brought with them a culture of extreme independence and an almost complete indifference to the rules and authorities that governed life in the European world they had left behind. On Tortuga, the hunters encountered another group of people who had also been pushed to the margins of the colonial world: the filibustiers, the French and English sailors who had been operating against Spanish shipping in the Caribbean and who needed a base from which to operate, a place to careen their ships and repair their equipment and rest between voyages. The convergence of the hunters and the sailors on Tortuga was one of those historical accidents that have enormous consequences because it brought together two groups of people whose skills complemented each other perfectly. The hunters could provision the ships with dried and smoked meat. The sailors could provide the ships and the sea knowledge. Together, they could do something that neither could do alone: mount sustained operations against the Spanish colonies and shipping that brought back enough plunder to sustain the community. The society that developed on Tortuga in the middle decades of the 17th century was unlike anything else in the colonial world. It was overwhelmingly male, because women were rare on the island, and the life was not one that attracted families. It was multiracial, bringing together men from France and England and the Netherlands and Portugal, and from Africa, men who had been slaves or servants or soldiers or sailors, or simply men who had found no place for themselves in the ordered world of European society and had ended up at the edge of the Atlantic world, looking for something that they could not have named precisely, but that amounted roughly to the freedom to determine their own lives. It was violent, because violence was one of the few resources available to people who had no property and no legal standing, and who lived in a world where the Spanish Empire was always threatening to destroy them. It was also, in its own way, democratic. The Buccaneers had developed a set of customs and practices for organizing themselves that was genuinely remarkable. By the standards of the 17th century, a form of self-governance that allocated shares of plunder according to fixed formulas, provided compensation for injuries sustained in battle, and gave the ordinary members of a crew a voice in decisions that more conventionally organized ships reserved entirely for the captain. These customs were known as the Jamaica Discipline, or sometimes as the Articles, and while they varied from ship to ship and from time to time, they represented a genuine alternative to the strictly hierarchical organization of legitimate naval and merchant vessels. The buccaneer captain was elected by his crew and could be removed if he failed to perform, which was a form of accountability that no naval captain in any European fleet had to worry about. The island of Tortuga sits in the Windward Passage between Hispaniola and Cuba, a rocky promontory rising steeply from the sea on its southern coast and sloping more gently on the north, covered with the kind of dense tropical vegetation that made it difficult to navigate on foot and easy to defend against anyone approaching from the water. Its harbor on the southern coast was deep enough to shelter ships of considerable size and was protected by the rocky terrain above it in a way that made it naturally defensible. It was not a rich island in the agricultural sense, not a place where you could grow sugar profitably, but it was a place where you could live if you were willing to work hard and take risks. And it was a place from which you could reach the shipping lanes of the Spanish Main with relatively little difficulty. The word Tortuga is Spanish for turtle, and the island does indeed have a vague resemblance to a turtle's shell when seen from the sea. The rocky southern coast, forming something like a carapace above the harbor, the name stuck even after the Spanish lost effective control of the island to the French and their buccaneer allies in the 1640s, and it has become one of the most resonant place names in the whole mythology of the pirate age, a word that conjures the particular world of the Caribbean, freebooters in a way that few other words can match. The French West India Company took formal possession of Tortuga in 1640 and began the process of turning the island from a purely informal buccaneer base into something approaching an organized colonial settlement. They appointed governors, the most effective of whom was a man named Bertrand d'Ogeron, who arrived in 1665 and spent more than a decade trying to impose some degree of order on a community that was not naturally inclined toward order. D'Ogeron was practical enough to understand that the buccaneers were the economic foundation of the island, and that any attempt to drive them away or to suppress their activities entirely would destroy the colony he had been sent to develop. He worked with them rather than against them, providing them with supplies and support. and a degree of legal cover in exchange for a share of their proceeds and a loose commitment to operating under French rather than Spanish authority. The Tortuga that d'Ogeron governed was a genuinely extraordinary place, one of those locations where the collision of different peoples and different circumstances produces something that could not have been predicted from any of its components. The island's population was made up of French and English and Dutch sailors and hunters, of men who had escaped from Spanish prisons, and men who had deserted from naval vessels, and men who had simply been shipwrecked and found themselves unable or unwilling to leave. There were freed African men who had escaped from slavery in the Spanish colonies, and there were men of mixed heritage who did not fit into any of the racial categories that the colonial world was busily constructing. There were skilled craftsmen and ship's surgeons and navigators who had found the straight world uncongenial, and there were men with no particular skill except the willingness to fight and the inability to find a place in the ordered world. The commerce of Tortuga was the commerce of plunder, organized around the expeditions that the buccaneers mounted against Spanish shipping and Spanish coastal towns, expeditions that were dangerous and violent, and that produced, when they succeeded, the concentrations of wealth that made the risks worth taking. The plunder was brought back to the island and divided according to the articles, the customs that governed the distribution of proceeds among the crew, and then a significant portion of it was spent in the taverns and the shops of the island's small settlement, which created a local economy of astonishing vibrancy, given the island's modest size and limited natural resources. The taverns of Tortuga were the social center of the buccaneer community, the places where men gathered after long and dangerous voyages to drink and talk and gamble and do all the things that people do when they have been deprived of company and comfort for months at a time. The drinking was serious, and the gambling was serious, and the fights that resulted from both were also serious, but there was also a quality to the social life of Tortuga that was more than just dissipation, a quality of genuine fellowship between men who had shared danger and who understood, perhaps more clearly than most people, how fragile life was and how important it was to enjoy what there was of it while there was something to enjoy. The buccaneer culture had its own aesthetics, its own sense of honor, its own codes of behavior that were not the codes of European society, but were codes nonetheless, maintaining a kind of order in a community that had deliberately placed itself outside the structures of the legitimate world. The period that historians call the Golden Age of Piracy ran roughly from the 1680s to the 1730s, a span of about 50 years in which the Caribbean and the surrounding waters were home to an extraordinary concentration of pirates who operated with a boldness and a scale that had never been seen before and would not be seen again. The Golden Age was produced by a particular convergence of circumstances, the end of the wars of the late 17th century, that had employed large numbers of sailors and soldiers who suddenly found themselves without employment, the growth of colonial trade that produced rich targets, and the continued weakness of the European powers' capacity to police the enormous territory of the Atlantic world. The pirates of the Golden Age operated from several base locations, of which Tortuga was the most famous, but not the only one. Nassau in the Bahamas became increasingly important as the 17th century turned into the 18th, particularly after the War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713 and, flooded the Caribbean with unemployed sailors who had spent years as privateers and could not easily return to peaceful occupations. The island of Providence, or New Providence, as the English called it, with its harbor that could accommodate large vessels and its position on the edge of the principal shipping routes, became the pirate republic that Tortuga had aspired to be, a community of several thousand people living almost entirely outside the authority of any legitimate government. The ships that the pirates used were as varied as the men who sailed them. The sloop was the favored vessel of the Caribbean pirate, a fast single-masted vessel that was light enough to sail in shallow water and fast enough to run down most merchant ships in the open sea. The brigantine was another common choice, a two-masted vessel with a slightly larger crew requirement, but greater range and capacity. Larger prizes, the three-masted ships that merchants and navies favored, were sometimes taken and used as flagship vessels by the most successful pirate captains, but their deeper draft and their larger crews made them less practical for the kind of hit-and-run operations that were the mainstay of Caribbean piracy. The tactics of a pirate attack were calculated to achieve the maximum result with the minimum violence, not because the pirates were particularly merciful, but because violent resistance damaged the prize, and killing the crew reduced the value of what was captured. The preferred approach was to run up alongside a merchant ship, fly whatever flag would get them close enough to do so without triggering alarm, and then, at the last moment, raise the pirate flag and fire a warning shot across the bow. Most merchant crews, seeing the pirate flag and understanding that resistance would be both futile and possibly fatal, chose to surrender, and most pirate attacks ended without significant bloodshed on either side. The cases of extreme violence that punctuate the historical record were exceptions rather than the rule, though they were exceptions significant enough to establish a reputation for ferocity that served the pirates well, since a reputation for violence made surrender more likely and actual violence less necessary. The pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, was itself a psychological weapon of considerable effectiveness. The black flag with its skull and crossbones, or in some versions a skeleton or a heart or a sword, or some combination of these, was a communication to the target vessel that was intended to be absolutely clear. This is a pirate attack. Resistance is pointless. Surrender now and you will probably live. The red flag, which some pirates flew alongside or instead of the black, had a different and more ominous meaning, an announcement that no quarter would be given, that the attack was intended to result in the destruction of everyone on the target vessel, regardless of resistance. The red flag was rarely flown in practice because it removed the incentive for the target to surrender, but its existence as a threat added another layer to the psychological pressure that the pirates brought to bear. The articles that governed life on a pirate ship were among the most remarkable documents of the period, representing a form of social contract that was in some ways more equitable than anything available in the legitimate world. The captain was elected and could be removed. The quartermaster, who was responsible for the distribution of plunder and for discipline on the ship, was similarly elected and served as a check on the captain's authority. Shares of plunder were distributed according to a fixed formula in which the captain received a larger share, but not an overwhelming one, and the ordinary members of the crew received shares that were genuinely significant. Compensation was provided for injuries sustained in battle, specific amounts for the loss of a limb or an eye that represented a genuine social insurance against the occupational hazards of the trade. The democracy of the pirate ship was real. Though it had its limits, it applied only to the free members of the crew, not to the enslaved men, who were sometimes captured along with the ships they served on, and who had a more ambiguous status in the pirate world, sometimes being freed and incorporated into the crew, and sometimes being kept as property and sold. The democracy of the pirate ship also did not extend to the period of an attack, when the captain had absolute authority, or to fundamental questions of the ship's mission, which was always plunder. But within these limits, the pirate ship offered a degree of self-governance and a distribution of the proceeds of labor that was genuinely unusual for the period. The pirates of the Golden Age have become figures of legend, their stories told and retold in so many versions that it is sometimes difficult to separate the historical reality from the myth that has accumulated around them. But the historical reality is interesting enough without embellishment, and the actual lives of the famous pirates are in many ways stranger and more compelling than the legends that have replaced them. Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard, was the most famous pirate of the Golden Age, and his fame rested partly on his undeniable effectiveness as a pirate and partly on his extraordinary talent for self-promotion and the cultivation of a terrifying image. He operated primarily in the Caribbean and along the American Atlantic coast. In the years between 1716 and 1718, and in that short period, he accumulated a reputation that has never entirely faded. His real name may have been Edward Thatch rather than Teach, and the details of his early life are obscure. But what is known with reasonable certainty is that he was an experienced sailor who had served as a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession and who turned to piracy when the war ended and legitimate employment dried up. Blackbeard's appearance, which he cultivated carefully as a tool of intimidation, was genuinely startling. He wore his dark beard long and braided it into tails tied with ribbons, and in battle he reportedly tied slow-burning fuses under his hat and lit them, so that his face was surrounded by smoke and flame, giving him an appearance that his contemporaries described as demonic. Whether this was an actual practice or a piece of legend that attached itself to his name after his death is impossible to say, but the image of the smoke-wreathed pirate captain was clearly effective as a form of psychological warfare, and Blackbeard understood the value of terror as a substitute for actual violence. His real violence, when it came, was real enough. But much of his success came from the willingness of his targets to surrender before violence became necessary. He is best known for his blockade of the port of Charleston in South Carolina in 1718, during which he held the port to ransom for a chest of medical supplies, a modest enough demand that nonetheless represented an extraordinary humiliation for one of the most important ports on the American coast. He was killed later that same year in a battle with British naval forces led by Lieutenant Robert Maynard off the coast of North Carolina, in a fight that the accounts describe as extraordinarily violent, Blackbeard reportedly receiving multiple gunshot wounds and sword cuts before he finally died. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as evidence of his death and as a warning to other pirates. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was by some measures the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, capturing more prizes than any other pirate of his era and operating across a range that stretched from the Caribbean to the coast of Africa. He was Welsh, and he came to piracy relatively late, having been a respectable merchant sailor before being captured by the pirate Howell Davis in 1719 and choosing, or being forced, to join the pirate crew. He was a man of strong personal principles in certain respects, preferring not to operate on Sundays and not to drink alcohol, which made him unusual among his contemporaries. And he had a genuine talent for leadership that his crew recognized and that kept him in command through the extraordinary sequence of successes that characterized his career. Roberts was killed in 1722 in battle with a British warship called the Swallow, shot through the throat by grape shot at the very beginning of the engagement, a death that was as sudden and undramatic as his life had been dramatic. His crew, many of whom were drunk when the Swallow appeared, and who had not bothered to run because they believed their ship was fast enough to escape any naval vessel, was captured almost entirely intact. And the mass trial that followed in Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast was one of the largest pirate trials in history, resulting in the execution of 52 men and providing one of the most detailed records we have of how a golden age pirate crew actually operated. Anne Bonny and Mary Red were the two women whose presence on a pirate ship has become one of the most famous stories of the pirate age, though their fame rests partly on the novelty of their situation rather than on any particularly remarkable piratical achievement. Anne Bonny was an Irish woman who had run away from her husband to join the pirate John Rackham, known as Calico Jack for the calico clothing he favored, and she sailed with him as a member of the crew, reportedly fighting alongside the men when the ship was attacked. Mary Read had dressed as a man for much of her life, having been raised in male disguise by her mother, and she was serving on a merchant vessel as a man when Rackham's crew captured it, and she chose, or was forced, to join them. Their story ended in 1720 when Rackham's ship was surprised at anchor by a British privateer sent to capture them. Most of the crew, including Rackham himself, were below decks drunk when the attack came, and it was reportedly Anne and Mary and a single other crew member who put up any significant resistance. Rackham and his male crew were captured, tried, and executed. Anne and Mary were also tried and convicted, but both were pregnant at the time of their trial and were reprieved from immediate execution on that account. Mary Red died in prison, probably of fever. Anne Bonny's fate after her imprisonment is unclear, one of those historical loose ends that has generated speculation without resolution. Henry Morgan was not a pirate in the technical sense, but a privateer, a man who held a commission from the English colonial authorities in Jamaica, authorizing him to attack Spanish shipping and Spanish ports. The distinction between privateer and pirate was partly one of paperwork and partly one of perspective, and the Spanish, who were the primary targets of Morgan's expeditions, would certainly not have acknowledged it. What Morgan did was piracy by any practical definition, large-scale organized attacks on Spanish settlements that were characterized by extensive violence and that produced enormous amounts of plunder. But Morgan did it with official authorization, at least some of the time, and he eventually ended his career, not on the gallows, but as the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, one of the most remarkable career trajectories in the history of the Caribbean. His most famous achievement was the sack of Panama City in 1671. At the head of an army of buccaneers, that crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, through the jungle, and then defeated the Spanish force, defending the city in an open battle. Panama was the western terminus of the route by which the silver of Peru reached the Caribbean and from there Spain, and it was one of the richest cities in the Spanish Americas. Morgan's men sacked it thoroughly, and the amount of plunder they took away has been estimated and argued about ever since, complicated by the fact that Morgan himself was accused of keeping more than his agreed share, an accusation that speaks to the persistent tension between the democratic ideals of the buccaneer culture and the reality that the most successful operators tended to find ways to enrich themselves beyond the formal arrangements. The daily life of a pirate in the Golden Age was not primarily a life of adventure and excitement, but a life of tedium interrupted by brief periods of intense danger, which is the experience of most people who work at sea in any era. The ship was the world, a small wooden world of perhaps 50 to 150 men, depending on the vessel, and the rhythms of that world were the rhythms of the sea, the watches and the meals, and the maintenance work that kept the ship functioning, punctuated by the rare and momentous occasions when another sail appeared on the horizon, and the question of whether it was prey or predator had to be answered. The food on a pirate ship was better than the food on a naval vessel of the same period, not because the pirates were better provisioned, but because they were better able to supplement their stores with fresh food taken from their prizes, and because the democratic character of the pirate ship meant that the captain ate roughly the same food as the crew rather than from the separate and superior stores that naval officers routinely maintained for themselves. The staples were salt pork and salt beef and biscuit, the same preserved foods that sustained sailors on long voyages throughout the Age of Sail, supplemented by whatever fresh provisions could be taken when a prize was captured or when the ship put in at a friendly port. Rum was the drink of the Caribbean, a byproduct of the sugar industry that was cheap and plentiful, and that the pirates consumed in quantities that would alarm anyone concerned with their long-term health. The maintenance of the ship was a constant and labor-intensive process because a wooden ship in tropical waters was subject to a range of threats that required continuous attention. The worm, Teredo navalis, the shipworm, bored into the wooden hulls of vessels in tropical waters with a thoroughness that could render a ship unseaworthy in a surprisingly short time, and the only defense against it was to regularly beach the ship, careen it on its side, and scrape and treat the hull to remove the worm damage and seal the wood against further attack. This process, called careening, was one of the most vulnerable moments in a pirate ship's existence, because a vessel on its side on a beach was entirely unable to flee or fight, and a careening location that was discovered by a naval patrol could be a death trap. The pirates took this risk seriously and chose their careening spots with care, preferring remote beaches on uninhabited islands or the sheltered coves of friendly harbors. The medical arrangements on a pirate ship were, by the standards of the period, relatively sophisticated because the pirates had both a practical need for effective medical care and the financial resources to employ skilled surgeons. The articles of most pirate ships specified compensation for injuries, which meant that there was a genuine economic incentive to keep injured men alive and functional, and the pirate surgeons who appear in the historical record were often men who had been trained in legitimate medicine and who had come to piracy for the same reasons as everyone else, the combination of limited opportunities in the legitimate world and the attractions, financial and otherwise, of the illegitimate one. Surgery in the early 18th century was limited in what it could achieve without anesthesia or antiseptics, but the amputation of damaged limbs and the treatment of wounds with what tools were available was carried out on pirate ships with a care that was not always matched on the naval vessels they were fighting. The navigation of a pirate ship required skills that were less common than the skills of a fighting man, and the pirates valued and generally protected the navigators and pilots they captured from merchant and naval vessels, because the ability to find your way across the ocean and to navigate the treacherous shoals and passages of the Caribbean was genuinely rare and genuinely essential. A pirate captain who could not navigate was dependent on finding someone who could, and the historical record is full of cases where navigators and other skilled professionals captured from merchant ships were kept on board against their will, their expertise too valuable to release along with the rest of the crew. The relationship between the pirate crew and the ships and towns they attacked was more complex than simple robbery. When a merchant ship was captured, its captain and crew were generally treated according to how they had behaved during the attack. Those who had surrendered without resistance being treated relatively well, and those who had fought being treated considerably worse. Captains and officers who had a reputation for harsh treatment of their own sailors were sometimes subjected to rough justice by the pirate crew, who felt a class solidarity with the ordinary sailors they had come from, and a contempt for the authority figures who had abused them. Captains who had treated their men well were sometimes given back their ships and sent on their way, a form of pirate honor that the historical record documents with surprising frequency. The Spanish Main, the name given to the Caribbean coast of the South American mainland, and by extension to the entire zone of Spanish colonial power in the Americas, was the primary target of the buccaneers and pirates of the 17th and early 18th centuries, and the raids on its cities and its shipping lanes constitute some of the most dramatic episodes of the period. The Spanish colonial system had been extracting enormous wealth from the Americas for over a century by the time the buccaneers emerged as a significant force, and the wealth that moved through the ports of Cartagena and Portobelo and Havana was a constant temptation to anyone with the means and the audacity to try to take it. The raid on Portobelo in 1668, led by Henry Morgan, was one of the most audacious operations of the buccaneer age. Portobelo, on the Caribbean coast of Panama, was one of the most important ports in the Spanish Americas, the terminal point of the Silver Road from Peru, and the place where the treasure was loaded onto the galleons that carried it to Spain. It was protected by substantial fortifications, and the Spanish garrison was considerable, but Morgan had learned from earlier raids that the Spanish defenses were often less formidable in practice than they appeared on paper, and he attacked with a force of about 460 men in a series of coordinated assaults that captured the town's 3 forts in a single day of intense fighting. The sack of Portobelo was followed by a demand for ransom from the Spanish colonial authorities, a sum that the Spanish agreed to pay rather than see the town completely destroyed, and Morgan's return to Jamaica with his plunder was celebrated by the colonial authorities as a great achievement, which it was. in the sense that it had significantly damaged Spanish prestige and Spanish revenues. The fact that England and Spain were nominally at peace at the time made it somewhat awkward, but the colonial authorities were not inclined to be too precise about the legal status of an operation that had brought considerable wealth into the local economy. The destruction of Morgan's fleet by a magazine explosion at Maracaibo in 1669, which killed several hundred men and destroyed several ships in an accident that was as catastrophic as anything the Spanish had managed to inflict on him, did not end his career, but rather seemed to intensify his ambition. And it was after this disaster that he began planning the Panama expedition that would become his most famous achievement, the crossing of the Isthmus of Panama in 1671, leading a mixed force of buccaneers through jungle and swamp for 9 days before emerging on the Pacific coast and defeating the Spanish army at the Battle of Panama was one of the great military adventures of the 17th century, an achievement that required logistical skill and personal leadership of a high order, regardless of the moral complexities of the enterprise. The raids on the French and English and Dutch colonies by Spanish and French privateers and pirates were the other side of the equation, reminders that the Caribbean was not simply a Spanish world that was being raided by outsiders, but a world of competing colonial powers that were all attacking each other whenever circumstances permitted. The island of Jamaica, which the English had captured from the Spanish in 1655, was itself the product of a buccaneer-style operation, a naval expedition that had failed in its original target of Hispaniola and had seized Jamaica as a consolation prize. The English colonial authorities in Jamaica recognized from the beginning that the buccaneers based at Port Royal were both a military asset and an economic one, and they cultivated the relationship with studied pragmatism. Port Royal, the city that grew up at the end of a narrow spit of land protecting Kingston Harbor in Jamaica, was the most important English port in the Caribbean in the second half of the 17th century and one of the most remarkable cities in the Americas. Its reputation for vice and disorder was extraordinary even by Caribbean standards, and its taverns and brothels were allegedly surpassed only by its churches in terms of number, a comparison that says something about both the piety and the practicality of the city's inhabitants. The city grew rich on the proceeds of the buccaneer trade and on the legitimate commerce that the buccaneers made possible by suppressing Spanish interference with English shipping, and its prosperity was real and substantial, if somewhat precarious. Port Royal met its end not from the pirates or the Spanish, but from the earth itself in a catastrophic earthquake on the 7th of June, 1692, that caused a large part of the city built on the sandy spit to simply sink into the sea. In a matter of minutes, 2,000 people died, and most of the city's buildings disappeared beneath the water of the harbor, an event that contemporaries interpreted with the particular enthusiasm that they brought to signs of divine judgment as clear evidence that God had finally run out of patience with the wickedness of Port Royal. The loss of Port Royal contributed to the decline of Jamaica as a buccaneer base and to the shift of pirate operations toward the Bahamas that was already underway for other reasons, and it marked in a symbolic sense the beginning of the end of the world that the buccaneers had built. The golden age of piracy ended not with a single dramatic event, but with a sustained campaign by the colonial powers to suppress piracy that gradually reduced the number of pirates, drove the survivors into increasingly remote and unprofitable waters, and eventually eliminated the social and economic conditions that had made piracy viable. This campaign was driven partly by the genuine costs that piracy imposed on the colonial trade, and partly by the changing political situation in the Caribbean as the European powers consolidated their colonial presence and developed better capacity to police the waters around their territories. The appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718 was one of the key moments in the suppression of Caribbean piracy. Rogers was a former privateer himself, a man who understood the culture and the motivations of the people he had been sent to govern, and his approach combined the offer of a royal pardon to pirates who surrendered and gave up their trade with a vigorous military campaign against those who refused. He arrived at Nassau with a small naval force and found the harbor full of pirate vessels, and his combination of firmness and pragmatism gradually cleared it, executing those who continued to operate and incorporating the rest into the legitimate colonial economy. The royal pardon that Rogers offered was not the first such pardon to be extended to Caribbean pirates, but it was the most effectively administered, and it removed a significant number of experienced pirates from the trade in a short period. The psychology of the pardon was complex, because accepting it meant acknowledging that you had done something that required forgiveness, and many pirates were not willing to make that acknowledgement, not because they lacked the capacity for self-reflection, but because their identity was so thoroughly bound up with their rejection of the legitimate world that accepting a pardon from that world felt like a kind of defeat. Those who did accept the pardon found that reintegration into legitimate society was not always easy, that the skills of a pirate were not always transferable to the skills required by the colonial economy, and that the freedom they had valued was not easily replicated within the structures of legitimate employment. The trials and executions of the pirates captured in the campaigns of the early 1720s were conducted with a thoroughness that was deliberately theatrical, because the authorities understood that executions only served their purpose as deterrence if they were witnessed and discussed, and they arranged for the hangings to take place in public and for the bodies to be displayed afterward, sometimes in iron cages called gibbets, in locations that sailors would pass regularly so that the lesson would not be forgotten. The most famous of these displays was the hanging of Charles Vane and Calico Jack Rackham and several of their crew members in Jamaica in 1720, an event that was witnessed by Anne Bonny and Mary Read awaiting their own trials, and that was designed to demonstrate that the era of impunity was over. The broader context of the decline of Caribbean piracy was the consolidation of European colonial power in the Americas and the development of more effective naval policing of the Caribbean. The navies of Britain and France and the Netherlands had grown significantly in the early 18th century, and they were increasingly capable of maintaining a presence in the Caribbean that made it more difficult for pirates to operate freely. The merchant community, which had a legitimate financial interest in the suppression of piracy, lobbied consistently for more naval protection and was willing to contribute financially to the cost of it, creating a political coalition for suppression that was more effective than anything that had existed in the 17th century. The last significant Concentrations of Caribbean pirates were broken up by the mid-1720s, and by 1730, the Golden Age was effectively over. Piracy in the Caribbean did not disappear entirely, and it would resurface in various forms in subsequent centuries. But the particular combination of circumstances that had made the Golden Age possible, the large number of unemployed sailors, the weakness of colonial governance, the richness of the targets, and the existence of bases like Tortuga and Nassau, where pirates could operate with a degree of protection, was not replicated. The Caribbean settled into a more thoroughly colonial pattern, dominated by the plantation system and the slave trade and the commercial networks of the European empires, with the memory of the pirate age receding into the past. Tortuga itself declined after the establishment of the French colony of Saint-Domingue on the western part of Hispaniola, which provided a more attractive base for French Caribbean interests. The island returned to the relative obscurity from which the buccaneers had lifted it, its harbor quieter, its population smaller, its days as the capital of the pirate world, belonging to history rather than to current events. The ruins of the fortifications that the French had built in the 17th century crumbled slowly back into the island's vegetation, and the memory of what Tortuga had been was preserved not in any physical monument, but in the stories that people told about it. The legacy of the Caribbean pirates in the imagination of the Western world has been out of all proportion to their actual historical significance, and this disproportion is itself historically interesting. The pirates of the Golden Age were operating at the margins of the colonial world, in the spaces between the empires, and their significance for the colonial economies they raided was real, but not decisive, an irritant rather than an existential threat to the systems they attacked. But they captured the imagination of their contemporaries and have continued to capture the imagination of every generation since in a way that few historical phenomena can match. Part of the reason for this is the democratic element in the pirate story, the sense that the pirate ship represented a genuine alternative to the rigidly hierarchical world of the legitimate colonial order, that the articles offered something approaching equality to men who had been denied it everywhere else. This element of the pirate story has been perhaps over-romanticized, given the reality of pirate violence and the exclusions that the pirate democracy maintained. But it contains something real, a genuine critique of the social order, and a genuine experiment in alternative organization that was remarkable for its time and place. Part of the reason is also the sheer drama of the lives, the voyages into unknown waters, and the captures in the dark, and the treasures and the trials and the executions, and the whole vivid machinery of a life lived at the extreme edge of what was possible. The writers and artists who began telling and retelling the pirate story in the 18th century, most famously Daniel Defoe, whose General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, remains one of the primary sources for the Golden Age, understood the dramatic potential of the material, and made full use of it, and the tradition they established has continued unbroken to the present day. The Caribbean at night is still the Caribbean at night, the same warm dark water, and the same stars and the same smell of salt and tropical vegetation. The islands are still there, and the sea routes that the pirates sailed are still there, and the harbors where they careened, their ships are still there, though the ships are gone, and the men who sailed them are long gone, and the world they inhabited has been replaced by something very different, but the stories are still there too, moving through the culture, the way water moves through limestone, finding cracks and passages, surfacing in unexpected places, refusing to disappear entirely, no matter how many centuries pass over them. Let the warm Caribbean night settle around you. Let the sound of the sea on the coral shore fill the space behind the words, that low, steady sound that has been there since before any of these stories happened and will be there long after the last of them has been told. Let the stars come out above the dark water, those southern stars that the pirate navigators used to find their way across the ocean when there was no other guide and the horizon was dark in every direction. Tortuga is quiet now. The harbor is empty of pirate ships. The taverns are dark. The crews are gone, dispersed into the ordinary world or into the violent endings that the trade so often provided. But the stories remain, warm as the Caribbean night, full of the particular color and smell of a world that lasted only a few decades and that has never quite been forgotten. And so we leave the Caribbean resting in the darkness of 3 centuries. We sailed through the warm blue water of the Spanish Main and felt the heat of a world where the rules of Europe did not apply, and where people who had nothing to lose discovered something that felt, in its best moments, like freedom. We sat with the Buccaneers on Tortuga, those hunters and sailors who built something unlikely from nothing on a rocky island in the Windward Passage, and we tried to understand how a community so violent and so chaotic could have produced something as remarkable as the Articles, that genuine experiment in democratic self-governance that set the pirate ship apart from everything else in the 17th century world. We sailed with Blackbeard and Black Bart and Henry Morgan and all the other figures whose names have become synonymous with the pirate age, and we tried to see them not as legends, but as people, complicated and violent, and in some ways admirable, and in many ways not, people who were responding to the world they found themselves in with the tools available to them. We watched the golden age end in the gibbets and the trials, and the steady pressure of an empire that had finally decided that the spaces at its margins were not acceptable, and we understood that the end of the pirate age was also the consolidation of the colonial world that would define the Caribbean for centuries. These are human stories. The Caribbean is full of them, layered one on top of another, across 5 centuries of colonization and slavery and independence and everything else that has happened in that warm blue sea. The pirate stories are only one layer, but they are a vivid one, full of the particular color that comes when people find themselves outside the ordinary world and have to figure out how to live there. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small, quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue, and let the ancient world keep talking in its old, slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The Caribbean is quiet, the ships are still, the harbor is dark. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, let your hands open slowly. The way hands open when the last watch has ended, and the sea is calm, and there is nothing more to do until morning. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady in and out, like the warm Caribbean Sea moving against the shore in the darkness, patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to the passage of all these years. Sleep well, and good night.